June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea. 08:30 hours. The morning sun blazed across the Pacific like molten copper poured over an endless sheet of blue glass. Lieutenant Takeo Tanimizu tightened his grip on the control stick of his Mitsubishi A6M0, feeling the familiar vibration of the engine through his palms. At 23,000 feet, the air was thin and cold, biting through the gaps in his flight suit. Below him, the Japanese carrier fleet cut white scars across the ocean's surface, and ahead, somewhere in that crystalline vastness, the American task force waited. He had flown this aircraft for 2 years. He knew its voice, its temperament, the way it shuddered when pushed to its limits. The Zero had been his sword, and with it, he had carved his name into the history of naval aviation. Today, he expected to carve it deeper. He did not know that within the next 30 minutes, everything he understood about air combat would become obsolete. Around him, nearly 400 Japanese aircraft formed a massive strike wave, the largest concentration of naval air power Japan had assembled since Midway 2 years prior. Zeros, Judis, Jills, and Vals, their wings glinting in the morning light like a swarm of metallic insects. The pilots were young, many with less than 6 months of training, but they flew with the confidence of men who believed their aircraft were superior, their tactics proven, their destiny ordained by the Emperor himself. They had been told the Americans were soft, predictable, that their pilots lacked the spiritual discipline of the samurai warrior. The Zero had dominated Pacific skies for 3 years. It could out-turn, out-climb, and out-maneuver anything the Americans had fielded. Tanimizu had seen American wildcats fall like burning leaves when they tried to dogfight a Zero. He expected the same today. What he did not expect, what none of them expected, was the pale blue shape that appeared off his starboard wing at a closing speed that defied belief. The Grumman F6F Hellcat. But to understand the full weight of that moment, to comprehend the complete psychological collapse that would follow, we must step back 18 months, to the drawing boards of Bethpage, Long Island, where American engineers were designing an aircraft specifically to kill the Zero and everything it represented. The birth of a killer. By late 1942, American naval aviation was fighting with one hand tied behind its back. The F4F Wildcat, though rugged and reliable, was comprehensively outclassed by the Zero in almost every performance metric that mattered in a turning fight. The Zero could outturn it, outclimb it, and out-accelerate it in vertical maneuvers. American pilots survived not through superiority of equipment, but through tactical innovation. The thach weave, boom, and zoom attacks, never turning with a Zero if you could help it. They had learned to fight the war the aircraft would allow them to fight. Not the war they wanted to fight, but survival tactics are not victory tactics. America needed an aircraft that could meet the Zero on its own terms and destroy it. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation understood the assignment with brutal clarity. The F6F Hellcat would not be elegant. It would not be beautiful. It would be a flying sledgehammer wrapped in armor plate and powered by an engine that produced more horsepower than some pre-war destroyers. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, nearly double that of the Zero's Sakai engine. The Hellcat would be heavy, weighing over 15,000 pounds fully loaded compared to the Zero's 5,400. But that weight was purposeful. Armor behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing fuel tanks, bulletproof glass, 650 caliber Browning machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. The Hellcat was not designed to dance with the Zero. It was designed to smash it out of the sky through sheer kinetic violence. But armament and armor meant nothing without speed, and here the Hellcat revealed its true genius. Top speed, 380 miles per hour. Climb rate, 3,000 feet per minute. Dive speed is limited only by pilot endurance, not structural integrity. Hellcat could chase down a Zero in level flight, something the Wildcat could never do. It could climb with a Zero, match it in the vertical, and if the Zero tried to escape by diving the classic Japanese tactic, the Hellcat would simply follow it down, faster, closer, until the Zero was in gun range and the trigger was pressed, and 6 streams of 50 caliber rounds turned aluminum into confetti. The first production Hellcats rolled off the Bethpage assembly line in October 1942. By January 1943, they were aboard carriers. By August 1943, they were killing Zeros at a rate of 19 to 1. But those were isolated engagements, squadron-level actions, the kind of combat where individual pilot skill could still tip the balance. The Japanese High Command dismissed them as anomalies. The Zero was still supreme. The Americans were still learning. Victory was still inevitable. Then came June 19, 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The day Japanese naval aviation died. The expectation of glory. For the pilots of the Japanese strike force, launching from carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku that morning, the mission briefing had been clear and confident. The American fleet had been located approximately 200 miles west of Guam. The strike force would approach at high altitude, coordinate with land-based aircraft from nearby islands, and overwhelm the American combat air patrol through sheer numbers. The Americans might have more carriers, more aircraft, more of everything. But quantity meant nothing against Japanese fighting spirit, against pilots trained in the way of Bushido, against the Zero, which remained the finest fighter aircraft in the world. Lieutenant Tanimizu had listened to the briefing with the quiet confidence of a man who had survived 37 combat missions. He had shot down 4 American aircraft, 2 Wildcats, a Dauntless, and a B-24 bomber that had strayed too close to his patrol sector. He knew how Americans fought. They were cautious, methodical, bound by their tactical doctrines and radio chatter. They lacked the improvisational brilliance of Japanese pilots, the willingness to press an attack into the face of death itself. The Zero gave him the tools. His training gave him the edge. His spirit would deliver victory. As the strike force droned eastward across the empty Pacific, Tanimizu allowed himself to imagine the battle to come. He would spot an American fighter, probably a Wildcat, possibly one of the new models he had heard rumors about, and he would execute the classic Zero tactics. A sharp climbing turn to gain altitude advantage, then a slashing dive that would bring him onto the American's tail before the enemy pilot could react. The Zero's 20mm cannon would speak once, twice, and the American would tumble toward the sea trailing black smoke. Then he would climb back to altitude, find another target, repeat the process. By day's end, his victory count would be 7, perhaps 8. His name would be read aloud at the evening formation. His emperor would be honored. He did not imagine what was actually waiting for him beyond the horizon. He could not imagine it. The human mind struggles to comprehend its own obsolescence. The radar operators aboard USS Lexington detected the incoming Japanese strike wave at 1000 hours, when they were still 150 miles out. This was the first shock the Americans knew they were coming long before visual contact. Radar-directed fighter interception was still relatively new in 1944, but the Americans had refined it to a lethal science. Every carrier in Task Force 58 began launching fighters. Hellcats clawed their way into the sky in waves, 40, 60, 80 aircraft, stacking themselves at various altitudes between 15,000 and 30,000 feet. They were positioned not to meet the Japanese strike, but to slaughter it. Commander David McCampbell, leading Fighter Squadron 15 off USS Essex, took his division up to 24,000 feet and waited. The morning sun was behind him. The ocean below was a blue mirror. His Hellcat felt solid beneath him. Powerful, responsive, a weapon that obeyed his slightest input. Through his radio headset, he could hear the calm, professional voices of the fighter directors aboard the carriers, vectoring squadrons toward the incoming raid with the precision of surgeons directing scalpels. Vector 270, bogies at Angels 2 to 3, estimate 4 to 0 bandits. Then he saw them. A dark smudge on the horizon, resolving into individual aircraft as the range closed. Zeros. Dozens of them, flying in loose formations, their pilots still confident, still expecting to control the engagement through superior maneuverability. McCampbell rolled his Hellcat onto its back and dove. For Lieutenant Tanimizu, the first indication that something was catastrophically wrong came not from what he saw, but from what he heard. The radio frequency exploded with frantic Japanese voices, calls for help, warnings, shouts of disbelief. They're too fast. I can't shake him. Where did they come from? And then, cutting through the chaos, a sound that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life, the deep hammering roar of 50 caliber machine guns, a sound like industrial machinery tearing through sheet metal. He snapped his head left and saw a Zero disintegrate. Not catch fire, not trail smoke, but simply come apart in mid-air as if struck by an invisible hammer, pieces of wing and fuselage and engine tumbling away in all directions. The wreckage fell past him close enough that he could see the fabric control surfaces shredding in the airstream. He pulled hard right, instinct overriding thought, and that instinct saved his life because a pale blue fighter bigger than any aircraft he had ever faced slashed through the space where he had been seconds before, so fast that he barely registered its passage. A Hellcat. He had been briefed about them, told they were heavier than Zeros, less maneuverable, nothing to fear in a turning fight. But the aircraft that had just blown past him had been moving at a speed that made a mockery of those assessments. He craned his neck, searching for the Hellcat, expecting it to be far ahead, energy bleeding off from that high-speed pass. Instead, it was climbing impossibly fast, clawing back to altitude with an engine power that seemed to violate the laws of physics he had learned in flight school. Tanimizu pushed his throttle forward and hauled back on the stick, trying to follow, trying to gain the altitude advantage that would let him dive on the Hellcat and bring his cannons to bear. The Zero responded beautifully, as it always did, rotating around its axis with the grace of a ballet dancer. But grace meant nothing when your opponent could simply outrun you in 3 dimensions. The Hellcat reached 25,000 feet before Tanimizu reached 23, and now it was above him, behind him, diving again with its 650s aimed at his cockpit. He broke left, throwing the Zero into the tightest turn the airframe could sustain, and felt a moment of savage satisfaction as the Hellcat overshot, unable to match his turn radius. This was what he knew. This was where the Zero excelled. In a turning fight, no American aircraft could stay with him. He reversed his turn, trying to get inside the Hellcat's arc, trying to bring his nose around for a snapshot. But the Hellcat did not try to turn with him. It simply used its speed to extend away, climbing again, resetting the engagement on its own terms. And Tanimizu realized, with the slow dawning horror of a man watching his own execution, that he could not follow. His engine was already screaming at full throttle. His airspeed was dropping as he tried to maintain the climb. The Hellcat was pulling away from him as if he were standing still. Then it came back, diving, again, faster than before, and this time Tanimizu did not try to turn. He pushed his stick forward, diving as well, using gravity to build speed, hoping to outdive the American and escape into the cloud deck below. It was the classic Zero escape maneuver, the one that had saved Japanese pilots 1,000 times before. Dive, extend, use your lighter weight to accelerate faster in the descent, then pull up hard when the American could not follow. But the Hellcat followed, and it was faster, always faster. Tanimizu watched his airspeed indicator wind up 300 kilometers per hour, 350, 400 speeds that should have been tearing his aircraft apart. Behind him, the Hellcat matched his dive, exceeded it, and the sound of 50 caliber guns filled the air like the judgment of angry gods. Tracers walked across his left wing, punching through the thin aluminum skin as if it were paper. He felt the Zero shudder, felt the controls go mushy as hydraulic lines were severed. He rolled right, trying to throw off the American's aim, and saw 2 more Zeros falling in flames off his starboard side, saw Hellcats everywhere, pale blue sharks cutting through the Japanese formation with predatory efficiency. This was not a dogfight. This was an execution. He leveled off at 12,000 feet, diving for a cloud bank, and the Hellcat broke off, climbing away to find another target. Tanimizu did not feel relief. He felt terror, pure and absolute, the kind of terror that comes from realizing you are using obsolete tools in a modern war, that your training is worthless, that your aircraft, the aircraft you had trusted with your life, that had carried you through 3 years of combat, was now nothing more than a target in the sky. Around him, the sky was full of smoke and falling debris. Zeros tumbled toward the ocean, some intact and controlled, pilots trying desperately to escape back to the carriers, others trailing fire and black smoke, death spirals that would end in impact with the hard blue surface below. The radio was chaotic, screaming voices, prayers, silence where moments before there had been confident chatter. Of the nearly 400 aircraft that had launched that morning, fewer than 100 would return. The Americans would lose 29 aircraft total. The kill ratio was 14-1. But numbers do not capture the psychological devastation of that day. Numbers do not. Explain what it means to watch your Air Force, the finest naval air force ever assembled, torn apart by an enemy you were told you could defeat. Numbers do not convey the look in Lieutenant Tanemizu's eyes when he landed his damaged Zero back on the carrier Zuikaku, climbed out of the cockpit, and tried to explain to his squadron commander what had happened up there. The weight of realization. In the ready room aboard Zuikaku, the surviving pilots sat in stunned silence. They had launched that morning expecting glory. They returned, having witnessed annihilation. The statistics were read aloud by the air operations officer, his voice flat and mechanical, as if by removing all emotion he could somehow make the numbers less terrible. 243 aircraft lost, more than 200 pilots dead or missing. The American fleet had not been touched. Not a single bomb had hit a carrier. The entire strike had been intercepted and destroyed before reaching its targets. Lieutenant Tanemizu sat in the back row, still wearing his flight suit, still smelling of sweat and hydraulic fluid and cordite. His hands trembled. He pressed them flat against his thighs, trying to stop the shaking, but it would not stop. A junior pilot, a boy of 19 who had graduated flight school only 3 months prior, turned to him and asked the question they were all thinking. "Sir, what happened up there?" Tanemizu opened his mouth to answer and found he had no words. "How do you explain that everything you were taught was wrong? That the tactics you had drilled for months, the maneuvers you had perfected, the aircraft you had trusted, all of it was irrelevant now? How do you tell a young pilot that the war he thought he was fighting had already been lost, not through lack of courage or skill, but through industrial capacity and engineering superiority that Japan could never match?" He thought about the Hellcat, that pale blue machine that had been faster, heavier, more powerful, more durable than his Zero in every measurable way. He thought about the American pilot who had chased him through that dive, who had stayed on his tail despite the Zero's desperate maneuvering, who had fired with mechanical precision and broken off only when another target presented itself. There had been no hesitation, no doubt, no fear in that pilot's actions, just professional competence and overwhelming material advantage. The Zero had been designed in the late 1930s, when Japan's military philosophy emphasized spiritual strength over material power, when engineers were told to build the lightest, most maneuverable fighter possible, even if that meant sacrificing pilot protection and structural durability. The A6M was a beautiful aircraft, an elegant solution to the problem of carrier-based air superiority as it had existed in 1940. But this was 1944. The Americans had studied the Zero, captured examples, tested them, identified every weakness, and then built an aircraft specifically designed to exploit those weaknesses. The Hellcat was not more maneuverable than the Zero it did not need to be. It was faster, tougher, more heavily armed, and flown by pilots who understood that turning dogfights were suicide, that the key to modern air combat was speed and energy management, not graceful aerobatics. Tanemizu finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We cannot fight them. Not like this. Not anymore." The room went silent. To speak such words aloud was tantamount to treason, to suggesting that the Emperor's forces could be defeated, that Japanese spirit was insufficient. But no one contradicted him. They had all seen the same thing. They all knew the same terrible truth. The operations officer cleared his throat and attempted to restore morale. They would analyze the engagement, develop new tactics, and coordinate better with land-based aircraft. The Americans had simply gotten lucky, had positioned their fighters perfectly, and had caught the strike force at a disadvantage. Next time would be different. But Tanemizu knew there would be no next time. Not in the way they imagined. The Hellcat had not won through luck or tactical brilliance. It had won through brute industrial superiority, through an engineering philosophy that accepted weight and complexity in exchange for survivability and firepower. America could build Hellcats faster than Japan could train replacement pilots. American carriers could absorb damage and return to service. American pilots who were shot down could be rescued by submarines and destroyers and put back in the cockpit within days. The Japanese had none of these advantages. Every pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every Zero destroyed was one less to defend the home islands. The mathematics of attrition were brutally simple, and they all pointed in one direction. That night, lying in his bunk as the carrier steamed west toward the dubious safety of Okinawa, Tanemizu thought about his father's samurai sword, the family heirloom that had been passed down for 6 generations, that now sat in a shrine in Kyoto because regulations prohibited taking it aboard a carrier. The sword represented a philosophy of war that belonged to another age, where individual skill and courage could determine the outcome of battle, where the quality of the blade mattered more than the size of the army. But modern war was not fought with swords. It was fought with industrial output, with engineering expertise, with the ability to manufacture 10,000 aircraft and train 10,000 pilots and send them into battle, knowing that losses could be replaced. Japan had the spirit. America had factories, and in the cold mathematics of total war, factories always won. What the Japanese pilots did not understand, what they could not understand from their perspective, was that the Hellcat represented a fundamentally different philosophy of air combat, one rooted in American industrial culture and strategic thinking. Japanese aircraft design in the 1930s and early 1940s had been influenced by the samurai tradition, the belief that spiritual purity and individual excellence could overcome material deficiencies. Build a light, agile fighter, train the pilot to perfection, trust in courage and skill to carry the day. It was a philosophy that produced magnificent aircraft and superb pilots, but it was also a philosophy that could not scale, could not adapt to the grinding realities of industrial warfare. American aircraft design, by contrast, was influenced by mass production principles, by the assembly line thinking of Henry Ford, by the understanding that wars were won not by producing a few perfect weapons, but by producing thousands of good enough weapons and overwhelming the enemy through sheer volume. But the Hellcat was not merely good enough, it was very good. Grumman's engineers had looked at the problem of carrier-based air superiority and solved it with brutal efficiency. Make it fast. Make it tough. Give it guns that can tear apart enemy aircraft. Accept the weight penalty because American carriers were big enough to handle heavy aircraft. Accept the reduced maneuverability because American tactics did not require turning dogfights. Build it simple enough that factory workers with minimal training could assemble it. Build it durable enough that it could take battle damage and still bring its pilot home. Between 1942 and 1945, Grumman produced 12,275 Hellcats. By comparison, Japan produced approximately 10,500 Zeros during the entire war. But numbers alone do not tell the story. The story is about survival rates. A Hellcat pilot who was shot down had a 70% chance of being rescued. A Zero pilot who was shot down had less than a 10% chance. The story is in maintenance. A Hellcat could be repaired at sea, in the field, with basic tools. A Zero required specialized equipment and trained technicians that the Japanese fleet increasingly lacked. The story is about training. American pilots arriving in the Pacific by 1944 had logged 300 hours of flight time before their first combat mission. Japanese pilots by 1944 were lucky to have 100 hours, and that scarcity of training time reflected the scarcity of fuel, the scarcity of aircraft, the scarcity of everything except determination and courage. The Hellcat's kill ratio by the end of the war was 19-1. 19 enemy aircraft were destroyed for every Hellcat lost. This was not because American pilots were necessarily braver or more skilled than their Japanese counterparts, though by 1944, the experience gap was certainly significant, but because they were fighting with a weapons system optimized for the actual conditions of modern air combat. Speed, firepower, durability. The Hellcat had all three in abundance. The Zero had only maneuverability, and in the face of radar-directed interception and coordinated fighter sweeps, maneuverability alone was not enough. Commander David McCampbell, who would end the war as the Navy's top ace with 34 confirmed kills, described the Hellcat as an honest airplane. By this he meant that it did not try to be something it was not. It did not pretend to be as nimble as a Zero. It was a stable gun platform that could absorb punishment, maintain speed in a dive, and climb fast enough to regain energy advantage after an attack. It forgave pilot errors. It brought young, inexperienced aviators home alive, and it killed enemy aircraft with ruthless efficiency. For the Japanese, this was incomprehensible. How could a heavier, less elegant aircraft dominate the Zero so completely? The answer lay in understanding that air combat had evolved beyond the WWII-style turning dogfights that the Zero had been designed to win. Modern air combat was about energy management, about using speed and altitude to dictate the terms of engagement, about refusing to fight on the enemy's terms and forcing them to fight on yours. The Hellcat gave American pilots the performance envelope to implement these tactics. The Zero, for all its grace and agility, locked Japanese pilots into a tactical paradigm that was 3 years out of date. After June 19, 1944, Japanese naval aviation never recovered. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not merely a tactical defeat, it was a strategic catastrophe that destroyed the offensive capability of the combined fleet's carrier air groups. The pilots lost that day, experienced veterans and barely trained novices alike, represented years of training investment that Japan could not replace. The Hellcat had not simply won an air battle. It had broken the back of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. In the months that followed, Japanese pilots would encounter Hellcats again and again, and each encounter reinforced the same terrible lesson: you cannot outturn them, you cannot outclimb them. You cannot escape them in a dive. You can only hope to survive long enough to disengage, to run for cloud cover or the protection of friendly airfields, to live another day in a war that was increasingly hopeless. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. Pilots who had once flown with confidence now flew with dread. The sight of pale blue fighters in the distance was enough to trigger panic, to cause formations to break up before contact, to send men diving for the deck in desperate attempts to avoid engagement. Lieutenant Tanemizu flew 12 more combat missions after the Marianas Turkey Shoot. He survived them all, not through skill or bravery, but through caution and luck. He broke off attacks if Hellcats appeared, flew lower, slower, always watching the sky for those pale blue shapes that meant death. His Zero, once his pride, now felt fragile, inadequate, a relic from a war that had moved on without him. On his final mission, in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, he watched a division of Hellcats tear through his squadron like wolves through sheep. 5 Zeros lost in 3 minutes. No American aircraft were even damaged. He landed on a temporary airfield on Luzon, stepped out of his cockpit, and requested immediate transfer to ground duties. His request was denied. Japan needed pilots too desperately. But 3 weeks later, the airfield was overrun by American forces, and Tanemizu spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, alive because he had surrendered rather than fight to the death, a decision that would have been unthinkable for a naval aviator in 1941, but had become almost common by late 1944. The spirit of Bushido had not disappeared, but it had been tempered by the brutal reality of facing an enemy who possessed not just greater numbers, but fundamentally superior technology. If there was one object that came to symbolize the Hellcat's dominance, it was the simple panel of armor plate behind the pilot's seat, a 1/4 inch of steel that weighed 60 pounds and reduced the aircraft's performance by perhaps 5 miles per hour in top speed. Japanese aircraft designers had rejected such protection as wasteful, as evidence of defeatism, as suggesting that pilots might be shot from behind, which a properly skilled aviator would never allow. American designers had included it because they understood that even the best pilots made mistakes, that enemy fighters sometimes got lucky, that bringing your pilots home alive was more important than shaving 30 pounds off the airframe weight. That armor plate saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of American pilots from bullets that would have killed them in a Zero. It represented a fundamentally different valuation of human life, a different understanding of what it meant to wage war. The Japanese military culture valued sacrifice, expected pilots to press attacks even at the cost of their own lives, and treated survival as less important than mission accomplishment. The American military culture, shaped by democratic values and industrial abundance valued effectiveness. Wanted pilots to live to fight another day, understood that an experienced pilot was worth more than a dozen inexperienced replacements. The Hellcat embodied this philosophy in every rivet and weld. It was not the minimum aircraft that could barely accomplish the mission. It was the maximum aircraft that industrial capacity could produce, with every advantage that steel and horsepower and engineering could provide. And when Japanese pilots encountered it, they were not merely facing a superior airplane. They were facing the entire industrial might of the United States, concentrated into 6 tons of aluminum and firepower. By the war's end, Hellcats had destroyed more than 5,000 enemy aircraft. They had flown from ATS, every American carrier in the Pacific. They had provided cover for amphibious assaults from Tarawa to Okinawa. They had swept Japanese skies clean of defending fighters, allowing bombers to strike with impunity, and they had done all of this with a loss rate so low that American naval aviation could sustain combat operations indefinitely, grinding down Japanese resistance through sheer attrition, until nothing remained but the choice between surrender or annihilation. The Zero, meanwhile, had become a relic, relegated to kamikaze missions where maneuverability did not matter, where the aircraft was simply a manned missile aimed at American ships, where the pilot was expected to die, and the only question was whether he would take any enemies with him. This was the ultimate proof of the Hellcat's victory. It had forced Japanese aviation into a tactical dead end, where suicide was the only remaining option, where pilots were treated as expendable ordnance rather than valuable assets. There is a photograph, taken in August 1945 aboard USS Yorktown, of a young American pilot standing next to his F6F Hellcat. The aircraft is covered in victory markings, 32 small Japanese flags painted beneath the cockpit, representing confirmed kills. The pilot is smiling, relaxed, alive. He is 22 years old. He will survive the war, go home to Indiana, marry his sweetheart, raise 3 children, live to see his grandchildren. His Hellcat, after the war, will be pushed overboard during a deck-clearing operation, sinking to the bottom of the Pacific, where it will remain for eternity, a pale blue ghost in the darkness. There is no equivalent photograph of Lieutenant Takeo Tanimizu standing next to his Zero, because such photographs were not taken, because Japanese military culture did not celebrate survival, because by late 1944 there were no cameras to waste on such frivolities. Tanimizu would survive the war, return to Japan, and spend the next 40 years as a factory worker in Osaka, never speaking about his time as a naval aviator, never telling his children about the day he watched Japanese air power die above the Philippine Sea. He would die in 1986, an old man with nightmares about pale blue fighters diving out of the sun. The Hellcat did not win the Pacific War alone. That victory required submarines and battleships, marines and soldiers, industry and logistics, codebreakers and admirals, the atomic bomb and Soviet intervention, and 1,000 other factors. But in the realm of carrier-based air combat, the Hellcat was decisive. It gave American pilots an aircraft that could not just compete with the Zero, but dominate it so completely that Japanese aviators lost the will to fight. It transformed the air war from a contest of skill and courage into a grinding exercise in industrial attrition, where the side with more resources, better engineering, and greater pilot protection would inevitably prevail. The moment Japanese pilots realized the Hellcat had changed the Pacific War was not a single instant, but a gradual, terrible awakening that occurred over months of combat in 1,000 individual engagements where they threw their Zeros against American fighters and watched their comrades die for no gain. It was the realization that they were flying obsolete aircraft against a modern foe, that their training and courage were insufficient against an enemy who possessed both technical superiority and numerical abundance. It was the understanding that modern war was not a samurai duel but an industrial process, where victory went not to the most skilled or the most brave, but to the side that could produce more, faster, and replace losses without pause. The Hellcat represented something more than American air superiority. It represented the collision of 2 different philosophies of war, one rooted in tradition and spiritual strength, the other in industrial capacity and technological innovation. And in that collision, tradition shattered against the hard reality of assembly lines and engineering excellence. The Zero had been magnificent. The Hellcat was simply better. And in war, simply better is enough. In the end, the sky above the Pacific turned from contested space to American territory, patrolled by endless waves of pale blue fighters that flew faster, hit harder, and survived longer than anything Japan could field. And Japanese pilots, those who survived, learned to fear not just the aircraft itself, but what it represented: the inexorable truth that they were fighting a war they could not win, against an enemy they could not match, with tools that belonged to an age that had already passed into history. The Hellcat had changed everything, and once the pilots realized it, the outcome was never in doubt.